Thank you, Mr. The Russian delegation requested today's meeting in order to draw the attention of the UN Security Council colleagues to the actions and statements that directly or indirectly undermine the prospects of the diplomatic solution to the Ukrainian crisis. Recently, there have been many more such destructive moves, which raises more and more serious doubts in the sincerity and aspiration of those who have been growing and arming the Kiev regime from the very beginning in order to cross this page that is most dangerous for international peace and security. Today, many people in the West, due to the political conjuncture, have become enraged and are discussing the possibility of We, as you all remember, have not denied them from the very even after the anti-constitutional coup d'etat in Kiev in February 2014 and the dissolution of the Kiev regime, which aimed to purify all Russian military actions against its own citizens in the east of Ukraine, Russia agreed to the Minsk complex of measures approved by the UN Security Council Resolution 2202. Its purpose was not only to restore control of Ukraine beyond the eastern part of the border, but also a number of most important steps that Kiev had to take in order to do this. As we all know perfectly well today, the Minsk process has been considered by Western sponsors of Kiev from the very beginning only as a shield for the accelerated armament of Ukraine and its preparation for the war, inspired by the idea of using Ukraine as a kind of ram for Russia's military defeat, or at least its bloodletting and weakening. Western sponsors of Kiev have ignored all our calls to look for a mutually acceptable solution to the crisis around European security, which is primarily connected with the prospect of Ukraine's entry into NATO, and have left us no choice but to start the process in February 2022. A new chance for diplomacy appeared after the Russian and Ukrainian negotiators in Istanbul signed a peace agreement that could have stopped the armed escalation already in April 2022. Let me remind you that Russian troops were located a few kilometers away from Kiev at that time and were withdrawn from there exclusively in the order of goodwill, taking into account the progress achieved in the negotiation. It would seem that this is a great opportunity to eliminate this irritant, save hundreds of thousands of lives, and avoid the destruction of cities and infrastructure in Ukraine. But no, the plans of Western sponsors of the Kiev regime, the prospects of reconciliation of the two neighboring Slavic states, in which, for the most part, one people lives, were definitely not in. That is why Boris Johnson, a former prime minister, took part in the Game of London. A disgusting and clumsy provocation in Bucha was arranged in order to set the world's public against Russia, and everyone began to persuade Zelensky that with Western support and weapons, he would be able to cause Russia a strategic defeat. As a result, Ukraine continued to fight, putting aside Istanbul's. In fact, a full-scale proxy aggression of NATO against our country took place, within which Ukraine is no more than a private military company fighting with Western weapons and for Western interests. With the fact that it was a fatal strategic mistake of the Kiev prince, today no one argues. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers died. Russia had to destroy an unprecedented number of Western weapons, destroy military facilities in Ukraine, and everything that constitutes its military potential. During this time, this country, in addition to Crimea, which disbanded with Russia immediately after the coup in Kiev in 2014, lost 4 more regions, the population of which spoke in favor of entering. And what remains of Ukraine today has turned into a corrupt dictatorship of one person, in which Ukrainians are deprived of any rights and have become nothing more than cannon fodder, caught on the street and sent to the front against their will. It is difficult to argue with this, especially taking into account the facts that we brought to the previous meeting of the Council on Ukrainian issues a few days. The saddest thing is that Ukrainians were completely deprived of their voice, and if they had kept their voice, they would have had the opportunity to speak out against the continuation of. However, the expired former Kalmyk is not going to hold elections, at which he and his accomplices, judging by the most loyal polls of public opinion, have practically no chance of staying in. And how do our Western colleagues, who usually look for a twig in someone else's eye, Look at all this. When it comes to democracy and compliance with human rights, not at all. They simply remained silent and only began to tremble a little when Zelensky's cry was bitten by hand pseudo-anti-corruption structures created by him, which play exclusively the role of a lever of influence on the Kiev leadership. As for the rest of Ukraine, in the West, it is still possible to say either well or how can one not recall the prophetic words of the outgoing Polish president Andrzej Duda, that Ukraine, like a drowning man, will pull everyone to the... So it turns out, and at the bottom, together with Ukraine, not only European economies, but also the notorious Western values, which are losing their content in the conditions of such drunken double standards, are coming to... Mr. Chairman, I think everyone who is watching the development of the Ukrainian crisis has noticed that the appearance of a peaceful tone in the statements of our opponents magically coincided with the exhaustion of the military potential of not only the Kiev regime, but also its Western sponsors. After all, today the problem is not so much in the resources for military support for Ukraine. If desired, even those suffering from the sanctions imposed by them against Russia and NATO countries will be able to find them. The problem, first of all, is in the exhaustion of the reserves of arms that Ukraine could have. And secondly, as I have already said, the Ukrainians no longer want to fight, and it becomes more and more difficult to drive them into the trench. And if they get there, then many try to surrender or flee at the first opportunity. According to the data of the Ukrainian General Staff, on average, more than 20,000 people are recruited. Accordingly, the Ukrainian army is retreating on all fronts, especially after the catastrophic adventure for the Ukrainian armed forces of Kiev. We will talk about its results separately at the informal meeting of the Security Council on the ARIA formula at the beginning of... And having realized this, the most realistic and pragmatic among the sponsors of the Kiev regime were forced to admit that the Ukrainians do not have such cards in their hands, which would allow them to dictate their conditions at the negotiation. No, and there will not be, no matter how much all NATO countries are together. And then these sponsors forced the Zelensky regime, as he did not resist, to agree to negotiations with Russia. This revived the prerequisites for a peaceful solution, and we immediately supported this scenario. More precisely, we never retreated from it, consistently from the very first day, confirming our readiness to achieve the solution set before our goal, not militarily, but diplomatically. After that, the Istanbul negotiating track was resumed, within which the third round took place on July 20. All agreements on the humanitarian tracks, which were discussed earlier, have been fulfilled. The second unprecedentedly large exchange of prisoners of war of about 200 people has been completed. There is an understanding that the same exchange will be held in the near future. In addition, there will be continued urgent sanitary exchanges of seriously wounded and sick people on the line of combat. In addition to the more than 7,000 bodies of the USSR soldiers handed over to Kiev, we are ready to give another 3,000. In force is our proposal to announce short-term sanitary pauses on the battlefield, allowing to pick up the wounded and evacuate the bodies of the fallen soldiers. In addition, Russia has fully worked out a list of 339 Ukrainian children received from Kiev to Istanbul. As it turned out, most of them were never on our territory, and 50 people turned out to be on their part. They raised the question of the return of underage Russian citizens who remained on the territory of Ukraine or were taken to Kiev by the European Union. They handed over the corresponding specific list. We also offered the Ukrainian side to think about the formation of 3 working groups on political, humanitarian, and military issues. We hope that this initiative will be positively perceived in Kiev. We are also ready to continue working to bring our positions closer to the memorandums on the vision of Russia and Ukraine, of the final regulation of the Ukrainian crisis, handed over during the second round. In a word, we are determined to continue the negotiation process in Istanbul. Mr. President, it would seem that such a development of events, when Russia and Ukraine resumed the negotiation process in Turkey, should inspire all our international partners and be perceived as the first step to future agreements that would allow to resolve the Ukrainian crisis. However, despite the Istanbul meetings, the party of war, which does not like such a scenario, scenario did not go anywhere in the West. Still, the voices of those who perceive diplomacy exclusively as a reason to criticize Russia and put pressure on it are heard. The logic that our agreement with the unconditional and long-term ceasefire is the only criterion for Russia's readiness or unpreparedness for peace is imposed, which does not fit into the context of the Ukrainian crisis. Why does it not fit? Because we have already, so to speak, passed the situation with the Minsk agreements that I mentioned today. Moreover, the Western sponsors of Ukraine do not even bother to hide the fact that any pause on the battlefield will be used to rearm the Ukrainian units, to rotate the personnel, and to prepare the Ukrainian armed forces for the resumption of the armed operations against Russia. So why do we need such a situation when the Russian army is confidently advancing on all fronts, and the Ukrainian armed forces on a number of sites are resisting with all their might, or have already given? Moreover, our opponents are not in a hurry to eliminate the key and root causes of the transition from the Ukrainian crisis to the hot, and those who seem to be involved in the negotiations do not give any guarantee. In other words, they put pressure on us so that we agree to a new Minsk, and at the same time they hold a stone by the shoulder and are preparing to return to the proxy war with us, the Ukrainian hands. As soon as Ukraine is ready, why do we need this? Can anyone explain? Not to mention why Ukraine needs this, the people of which, as I have already explained above, cannot even say a word about this scenario prepared. I will probably surprise some colleagues in this room now, but this scenario is absolutely not needed by our Western colleagues if, of course, we will assume that their statements about adherence to democratic values, compliance with human rights, and the fight against corruption are not empty words. Why do they need to cover up a regime that is based on the rooted and cave xenophobia of nationalism, which is rooted in the disgraceful history of Hitler's accomplices, who destroyed hundreds of thousands of Jews, Poles, Russians, Gypsies, the same Ukrainians during the Nazi occupation of Ukraine? After all, it was not by chance that the Polish Sejm established July 11th as the date of memory of the victims of the Bolshevik massacre, the day of memory of those who today in Kiev are taught to admire their children and whose names are called streets and... Don't you have a cognitive dissonance? And doesn't it arise among those who promote multiculturalism at home and fiercely fight discrimination based on language or nationality, and at the same time close their eyes to the policy of the Kiev regime aimed at burning all Russian, from language to its bearer? To burn here is not a figure of speech. It is enough to remember those who were burned alive on May 2nd, 2014, in the House of Trade Unions in Odessa. By the way, still a Russian-speaking city, only for the fact that they dared to stand up for their identity, for the right to speak their own language and teach their children about it, for the right to honor those heroes who liberated Ukraine from fascism, and not those who help them kill innocent, and those who defend freedom of religion at home. Shouldn't they show a red card to those in Ukraine who are persecuted by canonical orthodoxy, a history that is thousands of years old, who take away churches and carry out real persecution of believers? After all, by protecting Zelensky's regime, you are protecting exactly what you would never have allowed it. So why do you want us to allow all this at our own borders, in relations with people who speak the same language as we do and who profess the same? Where do these criminal double standards? Mr. Chairman, we have repeatedly confirmed that we do not seek to destroy Ukraine, its culture and identity. We are for the Ukrainian culture to coexist in this country with the Russian one, as it did decades before without any problems and conflict. We are not at war with the Ukrainians. They are a fraternal people for us, but with the criminal Kiev, and the Ukrainians are more and more clearly convinced of. We want to coexist with Ukraine, not with anti-Russia. How could I imagine that the United States would not coexist with anti-American? What is so foreshadowing? So let's make Ukraine changeable again together. After all, this is what we ultimately... It is important not to overlook another important aspect, without which it is unlikely that something coherent will come out of the Ukrainian regulation. I am talking about the very backbone that our Western partners... After all, we all understand that the Ukrainian crisis is only a derivative of a wider crisis generated generated by the years-long efforts of Western countries, which ignored Russian interests in the field of security. We also need to do something about it. We hope that in Europe and America there will be something more positive than another set of sanctions against Russia, which we have long been adapting to. Otherwise, the situation in Europe and the world as a whole will remain unstable, and we will not get out of this vicious circle of escalation and threat. For now, we only hear another horror stories that Russia is allegedly preparing an attack on NATO countries. More nonsense is even hard to imagine. In general, ladies and gentlemen, now is a good time to try to correct many mistakes and start cooperation instead of restraint. It is up to you to just remember that we will not retreat from our national interests, from our right to live in peace and not be threatened by our... Thank you for your attention.